Kale woke up to the smell of sizzling eggs and fresh toast. The soft hum of the city outside their apartment window was barely noticeable over the aroma of breakfast cooking. In the small kitchen, Juno flipped a pancake with a practiced flick of her wrist. "Good morning, Your Majesty," Juno said with a teasing smile. "The royal breakfast awaits." Kyle groaned dramatically as he rubbed his eyes. "I feel like I've been battling dragons all night. Can't a knight get a peaceful morning?" Juno chuckled, setting a plate of eggs, toast, and pancakes in front of him. "You mean battling tiny furry dragons?" Kale's ears twitched at that. He glanced at the floor. Nothing, but he knew better. For the past week, the apartment had been under siege, not by aliens or burglars or rogue robots. No, the enemy was much smaller, much craftier. Mice. Not ordinary mice. These were genetically enhanced, intelligent mice that had somehow learned to navigate their way through the smallest cracks in the building. Kyle had spent countless late nights trying to trap them, chase them, and sometimes negotiate with them in a very one-sided conversation that usually ended with him tripping over furniture. "I think they're planning something," Kyle said, more to himself than to Juno. He poked at a piece of toast absent-mindedly. "I saw them last night. They were, I don't know, coordinating, like a tiny army." Juno rolled her eyes, still smiling. "Oh, come on. They're just mice. Maybe a few smart mice, but an army." Kale narrowed his eyes. "These aren't just mice. They're tactical. I saw them moving supplies, little pieces of tech I left on the counter. They know what they're doing." Juno raised an eyebrow, clearly more interested in making the perfect pancake than in Kale's war stories. "And what were you doing while they were moving your supplies? Sleeping like a regular human?" Kyle smirked. "No, I was guarding strategically." Juno laughed, picking up the pancake spatula and twirling it in her fingers. "You're a terrible knight against mice." Kyle shot her a mock glare. "Terrible? Maybe. But your breakfast is amazing." Juno paused, genuinely touched. Kale rarely gave compliments without a hidden meaning. This one, however, was sincere. He picked up his fork, cut into the eggs, and took a bite. The flavors were perfect, as always. The moment was broken by a tiny squeak from under the sink. Kyle froze, the faintest scuttling sound. You hear that?" Kyle asked, pointing toward the cabinet. Juno followed his gaze. "Hear what?" Kale crouched slightly, listening. The squeaks repeated, this time accompanied by a faint scratching. His heart raced. The mice had returned. "They're back," Kale muttered, "and I think they're smarter than ever." Juno finally got curious. "Smarter than ever? Kale, it's just a mouse. You're imagining things." But Kale wasn't imagining. He carefully slid a small sensor device under the cabinet. It blinked softly as it scanned for movement. Within seconds, it detected multiple heat signatures. Tiny, but coordinated. "See? Tactical, organized. Definitely more than a couple of mice," Kyle said, his voice a mix of excitement and worry. Juno leaned closer to look. "Huh. I mean, okay, that's a lot of mice. But tactical?" Kyle nodded, eyes serious. "Trust me. We have to be careful. These guys aren't just stealing crumbs. I think they're gathering resources for something bigger." Juno raised an eyebrow. "Something bigger? What, world domination? They're not exactly threatening a galactic empire." Kale smiled faintly, though he remained tense. "Maybe not a galactic empire yet, but they're smart enough to cause serious trouble if we ignore them." Juno sighed. "Fine. But for now, can you at least eat breakfast before plotting world defense? You might need energy." Kyle hesitated, then chuckled. "You know what? You're right. Breakfast first, war later." They ate in relative silence, broken only by the occasional clink of utensils and the distant hum of the city outside. But Cale's mind was far from peaceful. He couldn't shake the feeling that these mice were just the beginning. After breakfast, Cale gathered his night gear, a small toolkit, some laser sensors, a few homemade gadgets designed to detect and capture the mice, and a notepad filled with diagrams. Juno watched, curious and slightly amused. "You really take this seriously," she said. "I just make pancakes and you prepare for a siege." Cale smirked. "You underestimate them. Look at last night. I nearly caught one of them in the kitchen and it escaped with a tiny microchip from my toolkit." "A microchip? Do you realize how precise that is?" Juno shook her head, laughing. "I guess that is impressive, but also terrifying?" Cale didn't answer. He crouched near the floor, placing a miniature camera under the cabinet to observe the mice. Then, quietly, he waited. Minutes passed. Nothing. Kyle leaned back, rubbing his chin. Maybe they had gone foraging elsewhere. Maybe he had overestimated them. Then, suddenly, a tiny paw reached from a crack near the wall, followed by a small, sleek body with glinting eyes. Cale held his breath. The mouse carried something shiny, part of a gadget Cale had left out. It looked at him, paused, and then disappeared back into the crack. Cale's jaw dropped. "I knew it. They're organized. They know what they're doing." Juno leaned over his shoulder. "I have to admit, that's kind of amazing. A tiny army of tech-savvy mice in our apartment." Cale grinned, though his mind raced. "Amazing, yes, but dangerous. If they start combining tech like that, I don't even want to imagine what they could build." Juno smirked. "Well, I suppose if anyone can handle it, it's the guy who calls himself a knight." Cale chuckled, standing up. "Knight, yes. Terrible knight, maybe. But a knight nonetheless. And I have a plan." "What kind of plan?" Juno asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Cale hesitated, then smiled. "For now, observation, strategy, and maybe breakfast reinforcement. Keep morale high." Juno laughed. "Of course, can't fight a mouse army on an empty stomach." As Cale prepared his tiny gadgets, Juno served another plate of breakfast, more pancakes this time, and the two roommates shared a quiet moment of laughter, unaware that the tiny invaders were already plotting their next move. The sun rose higher outside, glinting off the skyscrapers and the glass windows of their apartment. Inside, Kyle and Juno were ready, in their own way, for the adventure that awaited. Little did they know, the mice were only the beginning. And thus began the strange, unexpected war between a terrible knight and an army of tiny, clever invaders. A war that would test Kyle's skills, patience, and even his breakfast-eating abilities. Kyle spent the rest of the morning setting up his tiny gadgets around the apartment. Laser sensors, motion detectors, and even a miniature camera that streamed live video to his tablet were now in place. Juno watched with amusement as he moved like a general preparing for battle, crouching and adjusting each device with intense focus. "You really take this seriously," Juno said, leaning against the counter. She sipped her coffee, her eyes following Cale as he crouched near the floor, adjusting a motion sensor. Cale didn't look up. "They're not just mice. These little guys are, well, smarter than I imagined. I need to understand them before they cause serious trouble." Juno rolled her eyes. "Or maybe they just really like your gadgets." Kyle finally glanced at her and grinned. "If it was just a gadget theft, maybe. But last night, I saw them communicating. They were moving things in patterns like they were following a plan. They almost reminded me of humans." Juno raised an eyebrow. "Humans? Really?" Kyle nodded seriously. "Yes. Look, I know it sounds crazy, but watch this." He pointed at a tiny crack in the baseboard. From it, a small mouse with glinting eyes emerged. It carried a tiny object, apart from his old wrist communicator. It scurried across the floor, stopped, and tapped the object against another mouse. Then it disappeared as quickly as it had come. Juno leaned in closer. "Wait, did they just work together?" Kyle whispered. "Exactly, that's what I mean. Coordination, strategy, teamwork. And it wasn't random. I think they're intelligent enough to plan." Juno laughed softly. "Well, I guess that makes you a terrible knight with a really clever enemy." Kyle smirked. "Terrible? Maybe, but I'm not giving up." He crouched near the kitchen floor, carefully observing. One mouse appeared, dragging a tiny piece of foil across the tiles. Another joined, picking up a small circuit board. The first mouse tapped a paw on the floor near Kale's sensor. The sensor lit up, but the mouse froze for a second, seemingly analyzing the reaction. Then it moved on. Kale's jaw dropped. "Did you see that?" he asked Juno. It adjusted its movements based on the sensor. It's thinking, learning." "They're learning." Juno's eyes widened. "Okay, that is impressive, and also a little creepy." Kale grinned. "I've never been more terrified and fascinated at the same time." He pulled out a notepad and began sketching the mice's movements. Circles, lines, arrows, patterns that showed their route through the apartment. Juno peered over his shoulder. "This is like tactical mapping for tiny mice." Kyle nodded. "Exactly. And if they're planning something bigger, we need to know what it is before it's too late." The room fell silent for a moment, broken only by the soft hum of the city outside. Kyle focused on the floor, watching as the mice worked with careful precision. They were small, but their intelligence and coordination were undeniable. "Maybe we should try talking to them?" Juno suggested, half joking. Kale shook his head. "Not yet. First observation. We need to understand them. If we approach too soon, we could scare them off, or worse, trigger a full-scale mouse attack." Juno laughed. "Mouse attack? You really need to lighten up." Kale smiled faintly. "I'm serious. They may be small, but they are clever. Look at this." He pointed to the camera feed on his tablet. On the screen, a group of mice worked together, carrying tiny objects to a corner of the room. One mouse held up a small piece of foil like a flag. Another tapped it with a tiny paw, seemingly giving instructions. Kyle's heart raced. "They're organizing," he said, barely whispering. "This isn't random. This is planning." Juno tilted her head, studying the screen. "Planning? For what? I mean, they're mice. They don't exactly need strategy for survival." Kale's eyes gleamed. "Exactly. If they're putting this much effort into stealing scraps and little gadgets, what could they do if they really wanted to?" Juno shivered playfully. "Don't scare me. I just make breakfast." Kale chuckled. "You make the best breakfast. And I plan defenses. That's teamwork." For the next hour, Kale quietly observed the mice. He noted their routines, their behavior patterns, and even the way they seemed to communicate. He was astonished by their intelligence. The tiny creatures weren't just scavengers. They were engineers, inventors in miniature, capable of solving problems faster than he could anticipate. At one point, a mouse dragged a tiny wire toward a crack in the wall. Another jumped to intercept it, seemingly negotiating in squeaks and gestures. Kyle leaned closer. "They're talking to each other. Maybe sharing ideas." Juno's eyes sparkled with curiosity. "Ideas? You mean, like brainstorming?" Kyle nodded. "Yes, brainstorming. They're clever enough to cooperate and innovate. It's amazing." Juno laughed. "So your terrible knight is facing a genius mouse army. That's a first." Kyle smiled, though a hint of worry remained. "I need to be ready. If they start combining technology, we could be in real trouble. But at the same time, I can't help but admire them." They're brilliant. Juno leaned back, crossing her arms. So what's the plan now, Genius Knight? Kyle stood up, pacing the apartment. Observation, data collection, and maybe subtle interaction. We need to understand them before making any moves. He paused, glancing at Juno. And breakfast. We always need breakfast. You never know when a good pancake can boost morale during a siege. Juno shook her head, smiling. You're impossible, but I guess that's why I like having you as a roommate. The day passed in a mix of quiet observation and small bursts of chaos. The mice continued their careful movements, stealing tiny objects, rearranging items, and occasionally testing Kale's traps. Each time, Kyle learned something new about their intelligence and adaptability. As evening approached, Kyle reviewed his notes. He had mapped their routes, identified key behaviors, and even predicted a few of their next moves. He realized that while he had been struggling to catch them, the mice had been quietly learning from him. They were adapting to his strategies as quickly as he tried to adapt to theirs. Juno entered the room with a tray of snacks. You've been working all day, time for a break. Kale smiled. Thanks. I think I've learned enough for today. We're not in immediate danger, but we need to stay alert. These mice, they're not ordinary. They're smart, resourceful, almost human. Juno raised an eyebrow. Almost human? Kale, you need to stop giving them so much credit. Kale chuckled. Maybe, but I can't help it. Look at what they've done today. They're tiny, but clever, and cleverness. That's something to respect. Juno sat down beside him, watching the mice through the glass cabinet door. I'll admit, they're kind of amazing, but don't let them outsmart you, okay? You still have night duties. Kyle nodded. I know, and I'll be ready. But maybe, just maybe, we can learn from them too. As the night settled in, the mice disappeared into their hidden corners. Kale and Juno cleaned up the apartment, sharing quiet conversation. The air was filled with the soft hum of the city and the occasional squeak from the tiny invaders. Kale felt a strange mix of excitement and caution. The mice were clever, intelligent, and organized. But more than that, they represented a challenge, one that he was eager to meet. And Juno, with her endless supply of breakfast and optimism, remained his anchor. Together they would face whatever came next, learning from each other, and from the tiny, surprising minds of their small opponents. Little did they know, the mice were not just acting randomly. Their intelligence was growing, and their plans were becoming more ambitious. The war was far from over, and Kyle would need all his courage, skill, and yes, even breakfast to face what was coming. The next morning, Kale woke to a quiet apartment. Too quiet, he thought. The faint hum of the city outside seemed softer, almost as if it too were holding its breath. Juno appeared in the doorway, holding a tray of toast and scrambled eggs. Morning, your night ship, ready to defend the kingdom today? She teased, setting the tray down. Kyle rubbed his eyes and sat up. I have a feeling it's going to be interesting, he said carefully. As he took a bite of toast, a sudden faint scratching echoed from the kitchen floor. Kale froze mid-chew. The sound was sharp, deliberate. They're back, he whispered. Juno leaned over, squinting. Who's back? The tiny genius mice. Kale nodded grimly. Yes, and I think they're testing their limits. He quickly set down his fork and grabbed a small handheld device, a scanner he had built to detect movement. He crouched low, scanning the floor. Several tiny heat signatures appeared near the sink. They're everywhere, he muttered. They've learned to avoid the traps. And now, I think they're starting a siege. Juno raised an eyebrow. A siege? You mean they're attacking us? Kale shook his head. Not attacking exactly. More like taking control of the kitchen. Look at this. He pointed to the camera feed on his tablet. The mice were moving in groups, carrying crumbs, wires, and even small tools. One mouse tapped the handle of a cabinet door with its tiny paw, causing it to swing open. Another pushed a tiny object inside, almost like they were using their environment strategically. "They're organized," Kale said. "And clever. Too clever." Juno glanced at the scene, a mixture of awe and amusement in her eyes. "I have to admit, it's kind of impressive. Tiny engineers taking over our kitchen. Who would have thought?" Kale didn't respond. He set up small laser beams across the floor, intending to catch at least one of the invaders. Moments later, a mouse approached. It paused, as if calculating the risk, then leaped over the beam with perfect timing. Kale stared in disbelief. "They're learning," he exclaimed. "Every time I set a trap, they figure it out faster than I can react." Juno sipped her coffee. "So, what's the plan? Are we going to have a tiny mouse war in the kitchen?" Kale shook his head. "No, we need a smarter plan. Observation isn't enough now. They're starting to adapt to me. We need to anticipate their moves, maybe even work with them." Juno tilted her head. "Work with them? Kyle, these are mice." "You want to negotiate with mice?" Kyle smiled faintly. "Not negotiate yet, but I think we can find a way to guide them without making them feel threatened. If they're smart enough to outsmart my traps, they're smart enough to follow a little encouragement." He spent the next hour carefully observing the mice through cameras and motion sensors. The tiny creatures were incredible. They carried objects with precision, moved in coordinated groups, and seemed to communicate in squeaks and gestures. Each mouse had a specific role. One collected crumbs, another transported tools, and a third appeared to scout the area. "They're like a tiny army with specialized jobs," Kale whispered to Juno, "and each one knows exactly what to do." Juno shook her head, half laughing, half amazed. "I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think I'm starting to respect them." Kyle grinned. "Respect, yes, but don't forget, if they combine their intelligence with the technology in this apartment, we could be facing chaos." Suddenly, the smallest mouse Kyle had ever seen darted across the floor, dragging a tiny foil wrapper. It slipped under the refrigerator, and moments later, a small object disappeared behind the cabinet. Kale's eyes widened. "They're stealing things again, but it's not random. Look at how they choose items carefully. Everything they take has a purpose." Juno leaned closer. "Purpose? You mean they're building something?" Kale nodded. "Possibly. And if they're building something, I want to know what it is before it's too late." He grabbed a notebook and began sketching the positions and movements of each mouse. Lines, arrows, and tiny symbols filled the pages. They're following a pattern. Every move they make is deliberate. Every step is calculated. Juno watched, fascinated. "You're like a general planning a counterattack, only the enemy is cute and tiny." Kyle smiled faintly. "Cute, yes, but don't underestimate them. They're clever, and they're learning fast." Hours passed. The mice continued their organized chaos, moving crumbs, tiny objects, and even testing the traps Kale had set. They were adapting, improving, and showing signs of strategic thinking. Kale realized he needed a new approach, one that combined observation, clever guidance, and maybe a little cooperation. "I think I need to set a controlled environment," Kale said, "something they can interact with safely. A small zone where we can study their behavior without causing panic." Juno raised an eyebrow. "Controlled environment? You mean like a tiny mouse playground?" Kale chuckled. "Exactly. A place where we can observe them, understand their intelligence, and maybe even guide them toward helpful behaviors." He gathered small boxes, scraps of paper, and tiny objects, carefully arranging them on a section of the kitchen floor. "We'll make this their workspace. They can explore, move things, and interact, and I'll be able to study how they think, plan, and cooperate." Juno leaned over, watching Kale set up the miniature zone. This is actually kind of brilliant, and a little insane, but brilliant. Kyle smiled faintly. Sometimes the only way to deal with a clever opponent is to meet them on their level. As evening fell, Kyle watched from a crouched position as the first mouse cautiously approached the new setup. It sniffed the objects, tapped them, and then looked around as if checking for danger. Another mouse followed, and soon a small group had entered the area, exploring carefully, testing, and interacting. "They're curious," Kale whispered, "and smart. This is perfect. We can learn from them, understand their intelligence, and maybe even use it." Juno laughed softly. "Use it? Kale, are you really thinking about making allies with mice?" Kale shrugged. "Why not? They're clever, organized, and capable of problem-solving. If we guide them instead of fighting them, who knows what we can accomplish?" For the next few hours, Kale observed every move. The mice were cautious but exploratory. They experimented with the objects, occasionally pausing to communicate with each other through squeaks and tiny gestures. Kale recorded everything, fascinated by their ingenuity. "They're almost like engineers," he whispered. "They think in patterns, plan their actions, and adapt to challenges. This is incredible." Juno smiled, setting down her coffee. "I still think it's a little insane, but I admit it's amazing. You're training a tiny army of genius mice." Kale laughed softly. "Training isn't the right word. Observation, guidance, maybe partnership in the future. For now, we learn, we adapt, and we prepare." The night grew darker, and the city outside twinkled with distant lights. Kale and Juno sat side by side, watching the mice explore their tiny kingdom. The apartment was still, except for the soft sounds of tiny paws and the occasional clink of an object moved by the invaders. Kale felt a mixture of excitement and caution. The mice were intelligent, resourceful, and organized. But more than that, they represented a challenge, one that he was eager to meet. Juno leaned back, smiling softly. "Well, Night Kale, I have to say, this is shaping up to be an interesting adventure. Just try not to let them take over completely." Kyle chuckled. "I'll do my best, but at the same time, I can't help but admire them. They're brilliant." As the night wore on, Kyle realized that the mice were no longer just pests. They were tiny, intelligent opponents, maybe even potential allies if he could understand them well enough. And he knew that the days ahead would test his creativity, patience, and yes, even his breakfast-eating skills. The war had escalated. The mice were clever, organized, and starting to take control of the apartment's resources. But Kyle wasn't giving up. He had plans, strategies, and a growing respect for his tiny opponents. And Juno, with her endless optimism and perfect pancakes, remained his anchor. Together, they would face the chaos of the micro-siege, learning, adapting, and discovering that intelligence and cleverness can come in the smallest of packages. The battle was far from over. The next morning, Kyle woke to a quiet apartment once more. The tiny invaders had not caused any obvious damage overnight, but the traces of their organized chaos were everywhere. Tiny objects shifted from their usual places, bits of crumbs, small scraps of foil, and even miniature tools Kale had left out were gone. He rubbed his eyes, trying to wake up fully. Breakfast was already being prepared. Juno hummed in the kitchen, flipping a pancake with a graceful flick of her wrist. The smell of sizzling eggs and fresh toast filled the apartment. "Good morning, Night Kale," Juno said, setting a plate down. "Ready for another day of mouse watching?" Kale smiled faintly. "Yes, but I think today will be different. We might have a chance to interact with them." Juno raised an eyebrow. "Interact? You mean like talk to mice?" Kale nodded. "Not talk in words, but guide them, encourage them, maybe even form a small alliance." Juno laughed softly. An alliance with mice. Only you would think of that. Kale set down his fork and stood, walking to the section of the kitchen where he had created the observation zone yesterday. The tiny mice were already active, moving with purpose and precision. They explored the small maze of boxes, tiny scraps, and objects Kale had carefully placed. "They're clever," Kale whispered, "but also curious. And curiosity is an opportunity." He grabbed a small plate and placed a few crumbs mixed with tiny edible pieces shaped like electronics. These were harmless, but they would attract the mice's attention and encourage them to move in specific patterns. Kale hoped this would allow him to gently guide their behavior. One mouse approached cautiously, sniffing the food. Another joined, and soon a small group was exploring the area. They moved with care, examining the objects, occasionally tapping one with a tiny paw as if testing it. Kyle watched closely, fascinated by their intelligence. "See?" he whispered to Juno. "They're learning. They're adapting. And if we use their curiosity wisely, maybe we can work together." Juno leaned over, smiling. "I can't believe I'm agreeing with you. But yes, they are impressive." Kyle carefully set up a small pathway of objects leading to another part of the apartment. The mice followed, picking up small items and moving them along the route. They paused at times, seemingly communicating with each other, then continued. Kale noted every movement, amazed by their coordination. "This is incredible," he whispered. "They're almost like tiny engineers, solving problems and working as a team." Juno chuckled. "And you're like their human supervisor." Kale smiled faintly. "Supervisor, yes, but more like a partner. If we approach this carefully, maybe they can help us, and maybe we can help them." For the next hour, Kale observed and guided the mice. He placed small objects along the pathway, encouraging the mice to carry them in specific directions. Each time, the mice adapted, learning new patterns, and even finding shortcuts. Kale scribbled notes furiously, tracking their behavior and responses. "They're learning faster than I expected," Kale said, "and they're cooperative when there's no threat. This could work." Juno leaned closer, watching the mice. "I have to admit, this is actually kind of exciting. A tiny army of engineers at your disposal. Just try not to overwhelm them." Kale nodded. "Of course, patience is key. Force would ruin everything. We need to guide, not control." As the day went on, Kale continued to refine his approach. He used a combination of small food rewards, gentle guidance, and strategic placement of objects to teach the mice patterns and tasks. The tiny creatures responded brilliantly, learning to navigate challenges, communicate with each other, and even carry objects in more efficient ways. "It's working," Kale whispered to Juno during a quiet moment. "They're learning, cooperating, almost like they understand our intentions." Juno smiled. "I guess breakfast really does make everything possible." Kale laughed softly. "Yes, breakfast and patience." By evening, Kale had created a small, organized zone where the mice could work, explore, and interact without causing chaos. He called it the Micro Lab. The tiny engineers moved with purpose, carrying objects, testing their environment, and occasionally pausing to communicate. Kyle and Juno watched quietly, fascinated by their intelligence. "They're amazing," Kyle whispered. "And I think if we continue like this, we can form an alliance, a true partnership, not forced but chosen." Juno nodded. "I can see that, and I have to admit it's kind of nice. Having these little guys around, they're clever but also fun." Kyle smiled. "Fun, yes, but also a challenge, and challenges are what make life interesting." As the night grew darker, Kale carefully monitored the mice's activity. They were calm, organized, and increasingly efficient in their movements. It was clear that they had begun to trust the environment Kale had created, and perhaps even him. They're responding to guidance, Kale whispered. They're learning without being forced. This is exactly what I hoped for. Juno laughed softly. I never thought I'd be rooting for a team of mice. But here we are. Kale smiled faintly. Sometimes, the smallest minds can teach the biggest lessons. We just need to pay attention. By the end of the night, Kale had gathered enough information to understand the mice's patterns, strengths, and weaknesses. He realized that they were capable of incredible problem-solving, but they also responded well to gentle guidance and encouragement. This is the start of something interesting, Kyle whispered to Juno. We can work with them, not as enemies but as partners. And maybe, together, we can achieve things we couldn't alone. Juno nodded. Just don't forget to eat. Even tiny knights and mouse engineers need energy. Kale chuckled. Of course, breakfast is essential, and teamwork even more essential. The tiny invaders had become more than just pests. They were intelligent, organized, and capable of learning. And Kale, with patience, observation, and a little clever guidance, had found a way to begin forming a partnership. As the city outside glimmered in the night, Kale and Juno watched the mice work, fascinated by their intelligence and coordination. The apartment was still, except for the soft sounds of tiny paws and the occasional clink of an object moved by the little engineers. Kale felt a sense of excitement and caution. The mice were clever, resourceful, and organized, but they were also potential allies, capable of achieving incredible things if guided properly. This is just the beginning, Kale whispered. The war might have escalated yesterday, but today we start building something new. Cooperation, partnership, and maybe even friendship. Juno smiled softly, pouring 2 cups of tea. Friendship with mice. You really have a way of making life interesting, Kale. Kale laughed softly. Life is always more interesting when you pay attention to the cleverest minds, even the smallest ones. And so, the micro lab became a place of learning, observation, and growing partnership. The mice explored, tested, and learned, while Kyle and Juno guided, encouraged, and observed. Together, they discovered that intelligence and ingenuity could come in the tiniest of forms, and that even the smallest allies could make a big difference. By the end of the night, Kale realized that the mice were no longer just opponents. They were collaborators, capable of creativity, problem-solving, and even cooperation. And with careful guidance, patience, and a little encouragement, this tiny army could become something extraordinary. The war had transformed. It was no longer a battle of knights versus mice. It was now a collaboration of minds, human and mouse alike, exploring intelligence, curiosity, and possibility. And Kale, the self-proclaimed terrible knight, felt a spark of hope. Together, they could build something truly remarkable. The morning sun streamed through the apartment windows, casting warm light on the small, organized chaos of Kale and Juno's living space. The tiny microlab that Kale had carefully constructed was alive with activity. The mice scurried across the floor with purpose, carrying tiny objects, testing pathways, and communicating in soft squeaks. Kale stretched and rubbed his eyes. Today felt different. For the first time, he didn't feel like a defender against an enemy. He felt like a partner in something new, something unexpected. Juno appeared in the doorway, holding a tray of perfectly cooked breakfast, eggs, toast, pancakes, and a small glass of juice. Good morning, Night Kale. Ready to start a new day? With our tiny engineers? Kale smiled. Yes. Today we move from observation to collaboration. We're going to see just how clever they can be, and maybe learn something ourselves. Juno chuckled. I'm just here for the pancakes, honestly. But I guess this is exciting, too. Kale crouched near the floor, gently placing a few crumbs, mixed with tiny, harmless objects, along a designated pathway. The mice immediately noticed the arrangement. One mouse paused, sniffed the crumbs, then tapped an object and nudged it toward another mouse. Soon, a small chain of movement had formed, with each mouse playing a role. "They're working together?" "Again," Kyle whispered, fascination in his voice. "But now it's even better. They understand the environment we've created for them." Juno leaned closer, watching the scene with wide eyes. "It's like they're learning and teaching at the same time." Kyle nodded. "Exactly. And if we keep guiding them carefully, maybe we can do more than just observe. Maybe we can build a real collaboration, humans and mice, working as a team." The tiny engineers continued their work. They dragged crumbs, moved miniature objects, and tested pathways. Each mouse had a specific role, and their coordination was impressive. Kyle took notes, occasionally adjusting the setup to test new behaviors. "They're adapting fast," he said. "Each challenge we introduce, they solve it in creative ways. They're brilliant." Juno laughed softly. "I have to admit, it's kind of amazing." Breakfast aside, I never thought I'd be impressed by a mouse army. Kale smiled faintly. "It's not just impressive, it's inspiring. Intelligence can come in any size." As the morning progressed, Kale introduced small tasks for the mice, moving tiny objects from one area to another, exploring hidden pathways, and even solving simple puzzles he created with scraps of paper and objects. The mice approached each task with focus, working together, adjusting their strategies, and often finding solutions Kyle hadn't expected. "They're learning from each other," Kyle whispered. "They're innovating, and they're enjoying the process, I think." Juno tilted her head. "Innovating and enjoying it. For mice. This is getting surreal." Kyle laughed softly. "Sometimes the smallest minds teach the biggest lessons. Patience, cooperation, and creative thinking. All in a tiny package." By midday, the mice had become remarkably efficient. Tasks that had taken several minutes yesterday were now completed in seconds. Kale marveled at their speed and precision. It was clear they had not only learned from their environment, but also from each other. "They're almost like tiny engineers," Kale said to Juno. "Each one specializes in a skill, and together, they create solutions I couldn't have predicted." Juno smiled. "Well, if tiny engineers can do it, maybe humans can too. With a little teamwork." Kale nodded. "Exactly, and that's the point. Intelligence, curiosity, and cooperation, whether in mice or humans, can achieve remarkable things." As the afternoon approached, Kale decided to take the collaboration further. He introduced a small structure, a mini construction zone made of scraps, tiny ramps, and objects to move and organize. The mice approached with curiosity. They tested the ramps, carried objects up and down, and even began forming small structures together. "They're building something," Kyle whispered, eyes wide. "And they're doing it efficiently, logically, creatively." Juno leaned over, laughing softly. "Building. With mouse teamwork. I never imagined this in my life." Kyle smiled faintly. "Neither did I. But that's the beauty of it. When we guide them instead of controlling them, they thrive. And when they thrive, we all benefit." Hours passed. Kyle continued to guide, observe, and occasionally adjust the setup. Juno kept the breakfast and snacks coming, quietly supporting Kale's work while also enjoying the tiny engineer's antics. The mice moved with purpose, tested new ideas, and even began experimenting with new ways to transport objects more efficiently. "They're thinking ahead," Kyle whispered, "planning beyond what we show them. They're truly remarkable." Juno smiled. "I think I'm learning patience from them too. And maybe teamwork." By evening, Kale had a complete map of the mice's behaviors, strengths, and patterns. He realized that the tiny invaders, once an enemy, had become collaborators. Their intelligence, curiosity, and creativity had transformed a small apartment into a laboratory of cooperation. "This is amazing," Kale said, crouching beside the tiny engineers. "They're capable of so much if we give them the right environment and encouragement." Juno nodded. "It's kind of like HFY in miniature, humans and mice achieving something greater together." Kale smiled faintly. "Exactly. Human ingenuity, guidance, and encouragement, combined with their intelligence. That's how we create something remarkable." The mice continued their work as the night fell. Tiny structures took shape, objects moved efficiently, and the sense of order and purpose was clear. Kyle and Juno watched quietly, fascinated by the collaboration unfolding before them. "They're more than just mice now," Kale whispered. "They're partners, allies, and maybe friends." Juno chuckled softly. "Friends with mice. Only you could turn a tiny invasion into friendship and innovation." Kyle smiled. "It's not just about friendship. It's about learning, adapting, and achieving together. And today, we've done that." As the night deepened, Kale reflected on the journey. The mice had started as opponents, clever and relentless. But with patience, observation, and guidance, they had become collaborators, capable of creative problem-solving and teamwork. The microlab was quiet now, except for the occasional squeak of a mouse testing a tiny ramp or moving an object. The apartment, once a battlefield, was now a hub of learning, exploration, and innovation. Kale turned to Juno. "We've come a long way, from tiny invaders to partners in innovation, and it all started with breakfast and patience." Juno smiled softly. "And maybe a little madness, too." Kale chuckled. "Perhaps. But the results speak for themselves. Intelligence, creativity, and teamwork can come in the smallest packages. And together, humans and mice can do remarkable things." As the city outside glimmered with lights, Kale, Juno, and the tiny engineers sat together in quiet harmony. Breakfast plates were cleaned, crumbs carefully shared with the tiny allies, and the sense of cooperation filled the apartment. The mice were no longer a threat. They were collaborators, partners in a small but extraordinary journey of discovery and innovation. And Kale realized that even a self-proclaimed terrible knight could achieve great things with patience, observation, and an open mind. "This is just the beginning," Kale whispered. "Our partnership and our discoveries have only just started. Together we can explore, create, and innovate beyond what we imagined." Juno smiled. "And I'll be here, pancakes in hand, cheering on our tiny allies." Kyle laughed softly. "Yes. Breakfast. Always breakfast." And so, the apartment that had once been a battlefield became a place of learning, innovation, and partnership. The mice, brilliant and clever, had become more than opponents. They were friends, collaborators, and a reminder that intelligence and creativity could be found in the most unexpected places. In the glow of the evening lights, Kyle and Juno watched the tiny engineers work, marveling at what had been accomplished. The war was over, replaced by cooperation. And in that partnership, they had discovered the true power of patience, observation, and teamwork. A human-mouse alliance that was nothing short of extraordinary. The journey of Kyle, Juno, and their tiny engineers had reached a remarkable milestone, and though tomorrow would bring new challenges, today had shown them that even the smallest allies could inspire greatness, and that together, humans and mice could achieve incredible things.